Since the beginning of humanity, there have been wars where young people fight without having their own reason, wars where most do not even understand why it is there. The truth is that war not only changes territories, changes bodies, changes minds, and changes entire generations, but that really makes war on a man, and why for centuries it was they who went to the front. The answer is in biology, in history, and in invisible scars that never heal. Let's see the science behind a soldier and that the war does not end when you lower the weapon first. Let's see the biology behind a soldier. It all starts before the first bullet. When they call you to war at this moment, the body already responds. The simple news shoots, anxiety, cold sweat, and palpitations. The mind anticipates danger in the sympathetic nervous system. It is activated as if you were on the battlefield. That as anxiety hits you, then comes the reality training, months of discipline to mold your body and marches, endless sleep deprivation, screams of commanders, is not only to teach you to shoot, it is to break your individuality and rebuild you as part of a larger machine. And when you get to the front, the body enters. In survival, adrenaline and cortisol floods in your blood every day. Not only at the first shot, your heart beats faster. Even when you sleep, your muscles tense up in your brain. Record each sound as if it were a threat. That constant stress becomes the real battle within the war. Not all bodies endure the same. Some seem made for high levels of testosterone, more tolerance to cortisol, even psychological traits such as greater aggressiveness and less empathy. The perfect profile of a soldier exists in theory, someone strong and disciplined, capable of obeying without questioning. But most recruits are not like that you put in the same trench. Biology begins to decide who resists and who breaks. The commanders, they know there are always soldiers who seem invincible, others who collapse in the first bombing. The problem that the war does not wait for those who were not ready, and when the body can no longer block, adrenaline and resistance becomes a nightmare that pursues even after returning home. Because if he manages to survive the physical war, what comes next is the mental war in the First World War. They called it shell shock. Soldiers who trembled without control, who were in absolute silence, or who simply could not walk again, even if they had no visible wounds. At first, it was thought it was cowardice. Today, we know that it was pure trauma, the brain collapsing under a stress impossible to sustain. But why post-traumatic stress occurs? The answer is in how memory works. When you live something extreme, the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes the engraving, the memory with such intensity that it becomes impossible to turn off the hippocampus that should order those memories in time, is overloaded. The result, he relives the war again and again as if he were still in the trench in World War II. They called it combat fatigue. Thousands of men were broken inside. Even if the doctors were physically, they designed a method called foot, proximity, immediacy, and expectation. That is, the idea was not to cure, but to stabilize it, just so that the soldier could return to the front as soon as possible to be able to process everything decades later in Vietnam. There was no way to hide it. Flashback the nightmares. Chronic anxiety spread to thousands of veterans. Then when the official term behind appeared, stress disorder, post-traumatic, and maybe some wonder if it is cured. But science says that the brain can learn to live with trauma, even reduce symptoms with therapy and medications. But it is never a total cure. The memory does not disappear. It only becomes more manageable, like a scar that no longer hurts every day but is always there. The soldier survives the external battle but begins to lose the internal, and for centuries. The image of the war was almost always the same men marching to the front while the women were left behind. But because the explanation is in a mixture of biology, culture, and power on average, men have more muscle mass and bone density that is not debatable in a world where war was body-body. That physical difference marked destiny. In addition, society assigned women other roles: care to cure, sustain life while men risked. But be careful does not mean that they were absent. There were warriors at all times, from the mythical Amazons, the Spartans to Joan of Arc, or the diabetic women who flew planes in World War II. The difference is that history erased them or reduced them to exceptions, but technology changed the rules when the war stopped depending only brute force and past fuses, tanks, and drones. The physical divide stopped mattering so much. And today, women fight in the ranks of the army in Ukraine, in the United States, and in many countries. In fact, some studies show modern contexts they support better than men, prolonged stress in the city council. So it was not that women could not go to war, it was that they did not let them. And now that they do it, science shows that the battlefield does not understand gender destroys whoever steps on it today. Wars no longer resemble those of a century. There are no trenches, endless, no cavalry charges now. There are drones and missiles that travel kilometers, and soldiers that can destroy without seeing nearby who kills. But technology changed the scars. They remain the same in Afghanistan. A decade of conflict to thousands of veterans with depression, anxiety, and addictions. And the hardest, the suicide rate in veterans leads to exceed that of deaths in combat in Ukraine and Russia. The trauma is multiplied Because they are not only soldiers, millions of civilians have lived bombings, displacements, and losses. Science already has a name for that. It's called collective trauma, when an entire society is marked by the war in Israel and Palestine. The war is lived in a different way, entire generations. They have grown up listening to sirens, hiding in shelters, watching relatives die. Psychologists warn that children exposed to this constant cycle of violence have more risk of anxiety, chronic, and depression in adult life, and here the disturbing. Today's war does not end when a treaty is signed. It remains engraved in the mind of those who lived in that of their children. Through what epigenetics calls legacy of trauma, stress can alter the way certain genes are expressed, and those marks are transmitted to the next generation at the end of the war. It always promises the same security, freedom, and peace. But if you think about it, it has ever fulfilled that promise. We really need to destroy ourselves so that after saying that, we find peace or war simply the price we pay for not knowing how to live together. Science explain how war can explain how it breaks bodies, how it alters brains, how it leaves scars in entire generations. But what it cannot explain is why we continue to lose. Maybe the real question is not that a man makes war, but if war is an inevitable part of what we are as a species. And if that is the case, that peace only exists as a respite between wars, I want to read what you think. It is the inevitable war, or one day we will leave it behind. Subscribe.